radio on the net, so push the donate button or subscribe to the archives for only, well, it's a Patreon account now. It's about $5 a month. If you're new to Shiny Slide Out, welcome aboard. This is a tinfoil hat zone, so keep your arms within the vehicle, turn off your personal reality inverters, and please, no flash photography. We are glad you're on board, so thank you for inviting us into your lives. So follow, subscribe, or otherwise for the appropriate social media platform. We are halfway through talking about, this is show number 444. Pause for Meki, who might be muted. All right, 440 and 400, talking about physical, biological artifacts. This is part 7 in our sequence or show arc, depending on where you're from. And since this is part 7, you probably want to collect or go back and review or listen to the other 6 parts that are prior to this. We hope that we've also made, and please comment below if you like it, please comment below in the YouTube. Also, we've split this into 2 chunks, so there's news and then there's a whole another hour of the show arc. So 1 hour's news and it's consumable as news, and you can just subscribe, and the other one is the show arc topics. So get yourself some great merchandise from the station's website. An EMP proof thumb drive, for instance. It has survival documents on it. You can get yourself seed packs, but follow the instructions clearly and understand your customs regulations so that you can avoid disappointment. For instance, in Australia, you can't import seeds because they can contravene our isolation policies, and the isolation ones are due to our quarantine for bugs and germs and things that could infect our crops. Now, we have one of the most isolated crop production facilities in the world, and we would like to keep those standards very, very high indeed, maybe exceed them. Now, Meki, we're on, as far as I can see, we're on something like page something or other. I can see I made a note from last week, page 35, thereabouts, and South American Homo erectus.
Yeah, that's exactly where we are.
Yay.
That's exactly right, my friend. Well done. And it's page 57. Is it? No, it's not. Sorry. 34, you're quite right.
Well, I'm on 35, so it's...
Oh, good.
I do a bit of formatting as we go, so it's all good. All right, so look, Meki, how about you take us through...
I will. Now, this is again extractions from the book that we shared with you before, and Cremo and Thompson, Hidden History of the Human Race, Forbidden Archaeology. I do recommend it to everybody. This is now, we're looking at some South American finds, which had some fairly unsettling implications. In 1970, so it's a fairly recent find, Canadian archaeologist Ellen Lyle Bryan found in a Brazilian museum a fossil skull cap with very thick walls and exceptionally heavy brow ridges, and were reminiscent of Homo erectus. The skull cap came from a cave in the Lagoa Santa region of Brazil. When Bryan showed photographs of the skull cap to several American physical anthropologists, they were unable to believe it could have come from the Americas, and proposed that it was either a fake, a cast, or possibly an old world skull cap that had somehow been introduced into the Brazilian collection examined by Bryan. But Bryan countered that both he and his wife, who also saw the skull cap, had abundant experience with human fossil bones, and they were both quite sure that the skull cap could not have been a fake or a cast. It was genuine. It was a genuine, highly fossilized human skull cap. That the Lagoa Santa calotte was not an old world fossil accidentally introduced into the Brazilian collection was supported, said Bryan, by the fact that it differed in several important measurements from known old world skulls, making it unique as opposed to European skulls. What is the significance of the Lagoa Santa calotte? The presence of hominids with Homo erectus features in Brazil at any time in the past is highly anomalous. Paleoanthropologists holding standard views say that only anatomically modern humans ever came to the Americas. Okay, only Homo sapiens ever made it there. The methodology of science allows for views to change, but the kind of change inherent in accepting the presence of Homo erectus in the New World would be revolutionary. Okay. The Lagoa Santa skullcap mysteriously disappeared from the Brazilian Museum after it was examined by Brian. An important skeleton discovered by Hans Reck at Alduvai Gorge also disappeared from a museum. In the case of Brian's and Reck's discoveries, we at least had a chance to hear about them before they disappeared. But, one might suspect that other fossils have also escaped our attention because they were misplaced in museums or perhaps intentionally discarded without first having a report referring to them.
The foxhole jaw. In 1855, a human jaw was discovered at Foxhall, England, by workers digging in a quarry. John Taylor, the town druggist, that's opposing all other vocations, purchased the foxhole jaw from a workman who wanted a glass of beer. And Taylor called it to the attention of Robert H. Collier, an American physician then residing in London. Collier, having acquired the fossil, visited the quarry on Mr. Law's farm. He noted that the bed from which the jaw was said to have been taken was 16 feet below the surface. The condition of the jaw, thoroughly infiltrated with iron oxide, was consistent with incorporation in this bed. Collier said that the foxhole jaw was the oldest relic of the human animal in existence. The 16-foot level at Foxhall is the same from the Moir, later recovered stone tools and signs of fire. Anything found at this level would be at least 2.5 million, just repeating, million years old. Aware that he was in the possession of a fossil of great significance, Collier showed it to various English scientists, including Charles Lyell, George Busk, Richard Owen, Sir John Prestwich, and Thomas Huxley. All of them were skeptical of its antiquity. Huxley, for example, objected that the shape of the bone did not indicate it belonged to an extinct or aberrant race of mankind, or aberrant. I'll get it. Here again, we encounter the mistaken belief that a modern-looking bone cannot be genuinely old. American paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn, writing in the 1920s about Moir's finds of the flint tools in the same area where the foxhole jaw was uncovered, wondered why the above-mentioned scientists did not take the trouble to visit the site. They disbelieved, said Osborn, probably because the shape of the jaw was not primitive. Also, the bone was not completely fossilized, but this is true of many other bones of similar age. After some time, the jaw mysteriously disappeared. It is almost never mentioned by modern authorities, and those who do mention it are invariably scornful. For example, we find in Fossil Men by Marcellin Boule, a French person, I'm presuming, this statement: "It requires a total lack of critical sense to pay any heed to such a piece of evidence as this." Wow, that is scornful. But many conventionally accepted bones and artifacts have also been found by uneducated workers. For example, most of the Homo erectus finds from Java were made by unsupervised, paid native collectors, and the Heidelberg Homo erectus jaw was found by German workmen, whose former later turned it over to scientists. If scientists can seriously consider these discoveries, then why can they not seriously consider the foxhole jaw as well? One might object that the Java Homo erectus fossils and the Heidelberg Homo erectus jaw are still available for inspection while the foxhole jaw has vanished. But the original Peking Homo erectus fossils disappeared from China during World War II, yet they are still accepted as evidence for human evolution.
Because they fit the picture. See, this is the
more
thing.
Clear as we go along, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and maybe it's just an interjection very quickly here as to why this is the case, right? Because there's always the question, well, why would people be like this? When Darwin first came up with his theory of evolution, he faced an enormous uphill battle. A great piece of thinking he put together, not original by himself, but he put together other people's work, and certainly being on the Beagle, it gave him some insights into adaptation and what the natural world looks like all across the world. But evolution as such was a really groundbreaking and completely novel idea, because it flew in the face of the accepted belief that God created man and everything else, and evolution was just a shocking thing. Even more shocking was that man, us, Homo sapiens, was meant to have evolved from ape-like creatures. That's something that was sit very ill with the Victorians of the age, or other people for that matter on the planet. They just didn't like it. It was a bad idea, and they didn't like to be, because that would mean that all human beings are essentially equal, right? Be they, of African origin or European origin, etc., etc. We all pretty much the same. And clearly, that wasn't the case in most people's minds at the time. So the Darwinists needed to be as dogmatic and as defensive as the church was in their beliefs, right? And they built a little wall, a little fortress around their belief system, because theory is a belief system, right? I mean, the theory is a theory; it's not fact. And Darwin was always hoping that the fossil record would bear him out, but the only thing that the fossil record has borne out is something that we, but that is being referred to as punctuated equilibrium, something that has recently come, in my mind, probably should replace the steady state evolutionary theory. It just makes more sense, but there, again, there's the issue of the prime mover and why do genes respond to outside pressures, etc., etc. So
yeah, it makes total sense.
Well, it does, but there's a problem, of course. Because if you've got a theory and it's just in its nascent state, and you've got a theory which is much stronger, which is the Christian theory at the time, or the religious theory, you had to build a fairly strong fortress, and you can't allow anything that detracts from it. And once you say something is a certain way, any weakening of your position, saying things like, oh, maybe human race is a lot older, or whatever, maybe we are, maybe we used to live together at the same time as Neanderthal, etc., etc., all of those admissions, right, which they would have been portrayed as, or failures of your original theory, would have been taken by the church or others as proof that evolutionary theory in totality is incorrect. Therefore, you cannot allow even the slightest crack in your armor, which of course flies in the face of science. But that's really where we are today. And people always say, oh, it's not science. Science wouldn't do that. Yeah, science would absolutely do that, because science is just people, guys. People are people. And they will always be people. Anyway, which brings us to the Castanedolo skeletons. Interesting. Millions of years ago, during the Pliocene period, a warm sea washed the southern slopes of the Alps, depositing layers of coral and mollusks. Late in the summer of 1860, Professor Giuseppe Ragazzoni, a geologist at the Technical Institute of Brescia, traveled to Castanedolo, about 6 miles southeast of Brescia, to gather fossils, or rather fossil shells in the Pliocene strata exposed in a pit at the base of a low hill, the Colle de Vento. Ragazzoni reported the following: searching along a bank of coral for shells, there came into my hand the top portion of a cranium, completely filled with pieces of coral cemented with the blue-green clay characteristic of that formation. Astonished, I continued the search, and in addition to the top portion of the cranium, I found other bones of the thorax and limbs which quite apparently belonged to an individual of the human species. Ragazzoni took the bones to the geologists A. Stoppani and G. Corioni. According to Ragazzoni, their reaction was negative. Not giving much credence to the circumstances of discovery, they expressed the opinion that the bones, instead of being those of a very ancient individual, were from a very recent burial in that terrain. I then threw the bones away, stated Ragazzoni, not without regret, because I found them lying among the coral and marine shells, appearing, despite the views of the two able scientists, as if transported by the ocean waves and covered with coral shells and clay. But that was not the end of the story. Ragazzoni could not get out of his mind the idea that the bones he had found belonged to a human being who lived during the Pliocene. Therefore, he wrote, I returned a little later to the same site and was able to find some more fragments of bone in the same condition as those first discovered. In 1875, Carlo Germani, on the advice of Ragazzoni, purchased land at Castellandolo for the purpose of selling the phosphate-rich shelly clay to local farmers for use as fertilizer. Ragazzoni stated, I explained to Germani about the bones I had found and strongly advised him to be vigilant while making his excavations and to show me any new human remains. In December 1879, Germani noticed some bones in his excavations, about 15 meters, about 49 feet, from the place where the first human bones were found. On January 2, 1880, Germani sent a message to Ragazzoni about the discoveries. Ragazzoni recalled, the next day, I went there with my assistant, Vincenzo Fracassi, in order to remove the bones with my own hands. The bones included pieces of the skull, some teeth, and parts of the backbone, ribs, arms, legs, and feet. More discoveries were to follow. On January 25, Germani brought Ragazzoni some jaw fragments and teeth. These were found about 2 meters, 7 feet, from the bones uncovered early in January. Ragazzoni returned to Castellandolo and found more fragments of skull, jaw, backbone, and ribs, as well as some loose teeth. All of them, said Ragazzoni, were completely covered with and penetrated by the clay and small fragments of coral and shells, which removed any suspicion that the bones were those of persons buried in graves, and on the contrary confirmed the fact of their transport by the waves of the sea. On February 16, Germani advised Ragazzoni that a complete skeleton was discovered. Ragazzoni journeyed to the site and supervised the excavation. The skeleton, enveloped in a mass of blue-green clay, turned out to be that of an anatomically modern human female. The complete skeleton, said Ragazzoni, was found in the middle of the layer of blue clay. The stratum of blue clay, which is over 1 meter, about 3 feet thick, has preserved its uniform stratification and does not show any signs of disturbance. Does not show any signs of disturbance, he added. That was my repeat. The skeleton was very likely deposited in a kind of marine mud and not buried at a later time. For in this case, one would have been able to detect traces of the overlying yellow sand and the iron-red clay called ferretto. In short, any burial would have certainly produced a noticeable mixing of different colored materials in the otherwise undisturbed blue clay layer. And Ragazzoni, a geologist, testified that there was no sign of such mixing. Also, the blue clay had its own stratification, which was intact. Ragazzoni considered another possible objection to his conclusion that the human bones from Castellandolo were as old as the Pliocene layer in which they were found. Perhaps streams had stripped away the layers covering the blue clay and penetrated partway into the blue clay layer itself. The human bones could then have been washed into hollows, and new material could have been deposited over them. This could explain why there were no signs of burial, but Ragazzoni said that it was unlikely that the human fossils had been washed recently into the positions in which they were found. The fossil remains discovered on January 2 and January 25 lay at a depth of approximately 2 meters. The bones were situated at the boundary between the bank of shells and coral and the overlying blue clay. They were dispersed, as if scattered by the waves of the sea among the shells. The way they were situated allows one to entirely exclude any later mixing or disturbance of the strata. Ragazzoni further stated, the skeleton found on the 16th of February occurred at a depth of over 1 meter in the blue clay, which appeared to have covered it in a state of slow deposition. Slow deposition of the clay, which Ragazzoni said was stratified, ruled out the hypothesis that the skeleton had recently been washed into the blue clay by a torrential stream. Modern geologists place the blue clays at Castellandolo in the Astian stage of the Middle Pliocene, which would give the discoveries from Castellandolo an age of about 3 to 4 million years. In 1883, Professor Giuseppe Sergi, an anatomist from the University of Rome, visited Ragazzoni and personally examined the human remains at the Technical Institute of Brescia. After studying the bones, he determined they represented 4 individuals, an adult male, an adult female, and 2 children. Sergi also visited the site as Catanodolo. He wrote, "I went there accompanied by Ragazzoni on the 14th of April. The trench had been excavated. The trench that had been excavated in 1880 was still there, and the strata were clearly visible in their geological succession." Sergi added the following: "If a hole had been excavated for burial, then it would not have been refilled exactly as before. The clay from the upper surface layers, recognizable by its intense red color, would have been mixed in. Such discoloration and disturbance of the strata would not have escaped the notice of even an ordinary person, not to speak of a trained geologist." Sergio also noted that except for the almost complete female skeleton, most of the bones were dispersed among the shells and coral below the blue clay, as if across a single flat surface. This supported the view that these bodies had come to rest on the shallow sea bottom. When they decayed, their bones were scattered by the action of the water. The almost entirely preserved female skeleton, said Sergi, was not found in a posture indicating ordinary burial, but rather overturned. Sergi was convinced. Sorry, what was that? There we go.
That was right.
Yeah, no, I know. I lost. Here. Sergi was convinced that the Castanodolo skeletons were the remains of humans who lived during the Pliocene period of the Tertiary. About the negative opinions of others, he said the following: "The tendency to reject, by reason of theoretical preconceptions, any discoveries that can demonstrate a human presence in the Tertiary is, I believe, a kind of scientific prejudice. Natural science should be stripped of this prejudice. This prejudice was, however, not overcome, and it persists today." Sergi wrote the following: "By means of a despotic scientific prejudice, call it what you will, every discovery of human remains in the Pliocene has been discredited." But Sergi was not alone in his acceptance of Ragazzoni's discoveries at Castanodolo. Armand de Quatrefages, familiar to us from our review of stone implements, this is a part of the book that we haven't shared with you guys, also accepted them. Concerning the female skeleton uncovered at Castanodolo, he said in his book, Races Humanes, or races or human races, "There exists no serious reason for doubting the discovery of M. Ragazzoni, and if made in the Quaternary deposit, no one would have thought of contesting its accuracy. Nothing, therefore, can be opposed to it but theoretical a priori objections." So it's the theory that interferes with reality here, right? So there's in the scientist's mind, it is a certain way, and that's just how it is. That's the truth, and nothing ever shall move it. And then evidence comes along, physical evidence that is contrary to that, and it is automatically dismissed because it is opposing the theory that's held in the scientist's mind. That's really what this means. In 1889, an additional human skeleton was discovered at Castanodolo. This find introduced an element of confusion about the discoveries of 1880. Ragazzoni invited G. Sergi and A. Issel to examine the new skeleton, which had been found in an ancient oyster bed. Sergi reported that both he and Issel believed this new 1889 skeleton to be a recent intrusion into the Pliocene layers because the almost intact skeleton lay on its back in a fissure of the oyster bed and showed signs of having been buried. But in his own paper, Issel went on to conclude that the 1818 discoveries were also recent burials. In a footnote, Issel claimed that Sergi agreed with him that none of the skeletons found at Castanodolo were of Pliocene age. For the scientific community, this apparently resolved the ongoing controversy. But Sergi later wrote that Issel was mistaken. Despite his view that the 1889 skeleton was recent, Sergi said that he never given up his conviction that the 1880 bones were Pliocene. But the damage had been done, and Sergi was not up to fighting a new battle to rehabilitate the 1818 discoveries. Thereafter, silence or ridicule became the standard response toward Castanodolo. A good example of the unfair treatment given to Castanodolo, the Castanodolo finds, may be found in Professor R.A.S. McAllister's textbook of European archaeology, written in 1921. McAllister admitted that the Castanodolo finds, whatever we may think of them, have to be treated seriously. He noted that they were unearthed by a competent geologist, Ragazzoni, and examined by a competent anatomist, Sergi. Still, he could not accept their Pliocene age. Faced with the uncomfortable facts, McAllister claimed there must be something wrong somewhere. what a what a great scientific conclusion. So, Dave, something to be wrong somewhere. First of all, the bones were anatomically modern. Now, if they really belong to the stratum in which they were found, wrote McAllister, this would imply an extraordinary long standstill for evolution. It is much more likely that there is something amiss with the observations. McAllister also said the acceptance of a Pliocene date for the Castanedolo skeletons would create so many insoluble problems that we can hardly hesitate in choosing between the alternatives of adopting or rejecting their authenticity. Now, just let's pause here for a second. This would imply an extraordinarily long standstill for evolution. Now, this was always one of the key objections that scientists had to finding these anatomically modern humans. But I want to, again, I know this is, we've brought this up many times, but it bears repeating here. The shark, the crocodile, and my favorite fish in the entire world, the coelacanth, have not changed. The coelacanth, first of all, hasn't changed at all in 60 million years. Zero. So this is an extraordinary standstill in evolution, according to Dr. McAllister here, right? I mean, sorry, Professor McAllister. But it's there. It is. It's a fact. You can stand on your head and dance around it as much as you want. The coelacanth hasn't changed in 60 million years. Secondly, while the shark and crocodile might have changed in size, right, shrinking, I guess, to today's sizes, they're still sharks and skeletons, and they're older than the coelacanth. Okay, they're hundreds of millions of years old, the crocodile and the shark, respectively. So, and it's always been my contention that if a species, and this is always assuming that evolution is a thing, if a species reaches optimal configuration, let's call it, why change? Why change? Why? What's the point? Why would you change, right? Because you should only, I mean, it's not survival of the strongest or the smartest, it's survival of the fittest. If your physical configuration is ideal or optimal for your survival, then you wouldn't change it. It makes no sense. Actually, it flies in the face of evolutionary theory, right? And that's notwithstanding that, obviously the environment changes, but human beings have adapted to living anywhere on the planet, pretty much, right? So sorry, I just had to interject that here. I'll give you one more sentence, and then I'll hand it over to my esteemed co-host. Here, once more, we find a scientist's preconceived ideas about evolution influencing him to reject skeletal evidence that would otherwise be considered of good quality. Right? Again, people's mindset, and this is confirmation bias of the worst kind. This is confirmation bias. Sorry, I guess it's the opposite of confirmation bias. If your evidence, your physical evidence, does not coincide with my preconceived idea, I will reject it. The same thing Robert Shaw faced when he discussed the age of the Sphinx. Same thing, exactly the same thing. Sorry, Dave. Tell us about McAllister.
McAllister cited Issel in support of his attempt to discredit all of the Castanedello finds, even though Issel's 1889 report really discredited only the 1889 skeleton. For example, McAllister, referring to all of the Castanedello finds, wrote, Examination of the bones and their setting by Issel and Geneva revealed that the fact that the strata were full of marine deposits and that everything solid within them, except the human bones, showed marine incrustations. While it is true that Issel reported that the bones of the skeleton uncovered in 1889 were smooth and free of incrustations, the same cannot be said of the earlier discoveries, which both Ragazzini and Sergi said were encrusted with blue Pliocene clay and pieces of shells and coral. Another example of the unfair treatment given the Castanedello discoveries is found in fossil men. In this book, Boole and Valus stated that it seems certain that the Castanedello ... we are dealing with more or less recent burials, but in fossil men, Boole and Valus devoted only one paragraph to Castanedello and did not mention the undisturbed layers lying over the skeleton or the scattered and incomplete state of some of the skeletons. Information that tends to rule out intrusive burial. Boule and Voilaz, I can't even say that in French, noted in 1889 the discovery of a new skeleton was the subject of an official report by Professor Issel, who then observed that the various fossils from this deposit were impregnated with salt, with the sole exception of the human bones, where Boule and Valois implied that that was true of the bones found in 1889, was also true of the bones found previously. But in his 1889 report, Issel described only the bones found in 1889. In fact, Issel did not even mention the word salt, referring instead to marine incrustations, which were, as above mentioned, present on the bones found in 1860 and 1880. Scientists have employed chemical and radiometric tests to deny a Pliocene age to the Castanedello bones. Fresh bones contain a certain amount of nitrogen in their protein, and this tends to decrease with time. In a 1980 report, K.P. Oakley found that Castanedello bones had a nitrogen content similar to that of bones from the late Pleistocene and Holocene. Italian sites and thus concluded the Castanedello bones were recent, but the degree of nitrogen preservation in bone can vary widely from site to site, making such comparisons unreliable as age indicators. The Castanedello bones were found in clay, a substance known to preserve nitrogen containing bone proteins. Bones tend to accumulate fluorine from groundwater, but that also depends on the quantity of fluorine in the water. The Castanedello bones had a fluorine content of Oakley that Oakley considered relatively high for bones he thought were recent. Oakley explained this discrepancy by positing higher past levels of fluorine in the Castanedello groundwater, but this was simply guesswork. The Castanedello bones also had an unexpected high concentration of uranium, consistent with great age. A carbon-14 test yielded an age of 958 years for some of the Castanedello bones. But, as in the case of Galley Hill, the methods employed are now considerably unreliable, and the bones themselves, which had been mouldering in a museum for almost 90 years, were likely contaminated with recent carbon, causing the test to yield a falsely younger age. The case of the Castanedello demonstrates that shortcomings of methodology employed by paleoanthropologists. The initial attribution of a Pliocene age to the discoveries of the 1860 and 1880 appears justified. The finds were made by a trained geologist, Gio Ragazzoni, who carefully observed the stratigraphy at the site. He especially searched for signs of intrusive burial and observed none. Ragazzoni duly reported his findings to his fellow scientists in scientific journals. But because the remains were modern in morphology, they came under intense negative scrutiny. As McAllister put it, there had to be something wrong. The account of human origins now dominant in the scientific community is the product of attitudes such as McAllister's. For the last century, the idea of progressive evolution of the human type from more ape-like ancestors has guided the acceptance and rejection of evidence. Evidence that contradicts the idea of human evolution is carefully screened out. Therefore, one who reads textbooks about human evolution, one may think, well, the idea of human evolution must be true because all the evidence supports it. But such textbook presentations are misleading, for it is the unquestioned belief that humans did in fact evolve from ape-like ancestors that has determined what evidence should be included and how it should be interpreted. Mackie?
Yeah, and unfortunately, Dave, that is completely true to the point where, like I explained earlier, this dogmatism is hurting us now. And look, in fact, it is now a foregone conclusion that we've evolved from apes, and as recently as 300,000 years ago. There's an article I recently, which we will share with you as part of the show cycle, and it talks about the most ancient Homo sapiens skeleton officially found was in Morocco, and it's 300,000 years old, which was 100,000 years older than previously thought. So if it takes baby steps to push us back further and further in the past, then so be it, right? But I firmly believe that we will find eventually enough evidence. Look, I think we already have found the evidence, but we'll find enough acceptance in the scientific community that the human race has been on this planet in one form or another for a very long time indeed. Okay, and we're only scratching the beginning here, the first layers. And see, it's not only the miners or regular workmen whose testimony is being discounted, because these are trained geologists and trained physiologists and anatomists and anthropologists. It is also their testimony, if it flies in the face of accepted science, is also discounted, right? So we can't use the excuse here that we know that these are just laymen, amateurs, and you can't trust what they say anyway. But if you've got scientists involved, then you have to think a little harder. And as McAllister put it, there has to be something wrong. Clearly, it has to be, because it's modern morphology. It cannot possibly be this. It cannot be what the evidence says it is. Which brings us to the Savona skeleton. We now turn our attention back to another Pliocene find, which was made at Savona, and it's a town on the Italian Riviera. Beautiful place, about 30 miles west of Genoa. In the 1850s, while constructing a church, workmen discovered an anatomically modern human skeleton at the bottom of the trench, 3 meters, about 10 feet deep. The layer containing the skeleton was 3 to 4 million years old. Arthur Issel, again, communicated details of the Savona find to the members of the International Congress of Prehistoric Anthropology and Archaeology at Paris in 1867. He declared that the Savona human was contemporary with the strata in which he was found. De Mortillet, however, wrote in 1883 that the Pliocene layers at Savona, deposited in shallow coastal waters, contained isolated bones of land mammals, while the human skeleton was largely intact. As this is not proof, he said, that instead of the remains of a human cadaver tossing in the waves of the Pliocene Sea, we are simply in the presence of a later burial of undetermined date. At the International Congress of Prehistoric Anthropology and Archaeology at Bologna in 1871, Father Deo Gratias, a priest who had been present at the time of the discovery of the human skeleton at Savona, gave a report indicating that it was not an intrusive burial. Deo Gratias, a student of paleontology, noted the body was discovered in an outstretched position, with the arms extending forward, the head slightly bent forward and down, the body very much elevated relative to the legs, like a man in the water. Can we suppose a body was buried in such position? Is it not, on the contrary, the position of a body abandoned to the mercy of the water? The fact that the skeleton was found on the side of a rock in the bed of clay makes it probable that it was washed against this obstacle. Deo Gratias further stated, had it been a burial, we would expect to find the upper layers mixed with the lower. The upper layers contain white quartzite sands. The result of mixing would have been the definite lightening of a closely circumscribed region of the Pliocene clay, sufficient to cause some doubts in the spectators that it was genuinely ancient, as they affirmed. The biggest and smallest cavities of the human bones are filled with compacted Pliocene clay. This could only have happened when the clay was in a muddy consistency during Pliocene times. Deogracius pointed out that the clay was now hard and dry. Also, the skeleton was found at a depth of 3 meters, again 10 feet, which was rather deep for burial. The combination of fossils found at Savona can thus be explained as follows. The site was once covered by a shallow shoreline, by the shallow shoreline waters of a Pliocene sea, as shown by the presence of characteristic shells. Animals could have died on the land, and their isolated bones could have been washed into the sea and incorporated into the formation. The human bones found in natural connection could have come to rest in the same marine formation as a result of someone drowning there during the Pliocene, perhaps after the sinking of a boat. This accounts for the presence of a relatively complete human skeleton amid scattered animal bones, without recourse to the hypothesis of recent intrusive burial. Keeping in mind that the posture of the skeleton, face down and with limbs outstretched, was like that of a drowned corpse rather than one deliberately buried.
Yes. Monte Hermoso vertebra. In chapter 5 of the book, which I'm sure we'll understand which book, we discussed the discovery of flint tools and signs of intentional use of fire at Monte Hermoso in Argentina. Now we will consider the human bone found there. An atlas, the topmost bone of the spinal column. Santiago Pozzi, an employee of the Museum of La Plata, collected it from the early Pliocene Monte Hermosan formation during the 1880s. It did not attract much notice until years later. At that time, it was still covered with the characteristic yellowish-brown loess of the Monte Hermosan formation, which is 3-5 million years old. That bone lay for years in a museum before it was recognized should not qualify. That bone lay for years in a museum before it was recognized should not disqualify it. The Gibraltar skull lay for many years in the Garrison Museum before it was recognized as a Neanderthal specimen. Also, several Homo erectus femurs from Java were shipped to Holland in boxes of bones. They went unrecognized and uncatalogued for several decades, but are now listed in textbooks with other accepted finds. The number of similar cases could be expanded, the point being that scientists have become aware of many fully accepted fossil finds in the same way as the Monte Hermoso Atlas. After the Pliocene loess was removed, I don't know how to pronounce that, I'm just pretending that's what it is, scientists carefully studied the bone. Florentino Ameghino, accepting that it was truly Pliocene, assigned the atlas to an ape-like human ancestor. In his description of the bone, he identified features he thought were primitive. But Alice, here's that name again, Mickey, go on. Herdlicker?
Perfect.
Convincingly demonstrated that the bone was actually modern in form. Like Herdlicker believed the human form should, as we proceed back in time, become more and more primitive. According to Herdlicker, if a bone was of the fully modern human type, then no matter what layer it was found in, it had to be of recent origin. Such a bone's presence in an ancient stratum always could be, indeed had to be, explained as some kind of intrusion. There is, however, another possible explanation. Human beings of the modern physiological type were living over 3 million years ago in Argentina. This is supported by the fact that the atlas showed signs of having been thoroughly embedded in sediments from the Mont-Hermosan formation. And in all, Hrdlicka felt that the Monte Hermosa atlas was worthy of being dropped of necessity into obscurity. That is exactly what happened. Otherwise, Hrdlicka's claim that humans only recently entered the Americas would have been placed on a very shaky ground. Today, there are many who also insist that the Monte Hermosa atlas remain in the obscurity into which it was of necessity dropped. Evidence for a fully human presence 3 million or more years ago in Argentina, of all places, is still not welcome in mainstream paleoanthropology.
And that's a fact.
Yeah.
All right. No, that's it. The Miramar jaw. In 1921, M.A. Vignati reported that a human lower jaw with 2 molars was discovered in the late Pliocene, and this in the late Pliocene Chapadmalal formation at Miramar in Argentina. Previously, stone tools and a mammalian bone with an arrowhead embedded in it had been discovered at this site, and the book refers to this in chapter 5. The jaw was discovered by Lorenzo Parodi, a museum collector. E. Bowman reported that Parodi found the jaw and its attached molars embedded in the barranca at great depth in the Chapadmalal strata at about the level of the sea. The jaw would thus have been about 2 to 3 million years old. Bowman, however, was skeptical. He stated, "The newspapers published bombastic articles about the most ancient human remains in the world, but all who examined the molars found them to be identical to the corresponding molars of modern human beings." Bowman took it for granted that the fully human nature of the Miramar jaw fragment unequivocally ensured its recent date. But nothing Bowman said excludes the possibility that the Miramar fossil demonstrated a fully human presence in the Pliocene of Argentina. Again, because the physical find didn't agree with the mindset theories held in the scientist's mind, it must therefore be a recent find. It had to be an intrusion, clearly. Dave.
That's absolutely true, and I'm just typing a post. Terrible. Okay, the Calaveras skull. In chapter 5 of the book that we're aforementioned book, we discuss the numerous stone implements discovered in the Auriferous gravels of the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, which I've been to. Human bones were also found in these gravels, which range from 9 million to 55 million years old. That's such a long time ago. Wow. Almost
the mind, right?
Yeah, right.
Shouldn't though.
It shouldn't, only because it goes against everything we've been indoctrinated to believe. I repeat, the history books that I learnt from were reprinted in 1956. Nothing new, despite wherever their original author date, their print date was. Anyway, in February 1866, Mr. Madison, the principal owner of the mine on Bald Hill near Angels Creek in Calaveras County, removed a skull from a layer of gravel 130 feet below the surface. The gravel was near the bedrock, underneath several distinct layers of volcanic material. Volcanic eruptions began in this region during the Oligocene, continued through the Miocene, and ended in the Pliocene. Since the skull occurred near the bottom of the sequence of interspersed gravel and lava layers at Bald Hill, it would seem likely that the gravel in which the skull was found was older than the Pliocene, perhaps much older. After finding the skull, Madison later carried it to Mr. Schreibner, an agent of Wells Fargo and Co.'s Express at Angels. Mr. Schreibner's clerk, Mr. Matthews, cleaned off part of the incrustations covering most of the fossil. Upon recognizing that it was part of a human skull, he sent it to Dr. Jones, who lived in a nearby village of Murphy's. and was an enthusiastic collector of such items. Then, Dr. Jones wrote to the office of the Geological Survey in San Francisco. After receiving a reply, he forwarded the skull to this office, where it was examined by J.D. Whitney, the state geologist. Whitney at once made the journey to Murphy's and Angels, where he personally questions Mr. Madison, who confirmed the report that was given by Dr. Jones. Both Schreibner and Jones were personally known to Whitney and were regarded by him as trustworthy. On July 16, 1866, Whitney presented to the California Academy of Scientists a report on the Calaveras skull, affirming that it was found in the Pliocene strata. The skull caused great sensation in America. According to Whitney, the religious press in this country took up the matter and were quite unanimous in declaring the Calaveras skull to be a hoax. Whitney noted that the hoax stories did not arise until after his discovery was publicized widely in newspapers. Some of the hoax stories were propagated not by newspaper writers but by scientists such as William H. Holmes of the Smithsonian Institution. There's another one, Mickey. During a visit to Calaveras County, he gathered testimony from some people who were acquainted with Mr. Schreibner and Dr. Jones, and this testimony raised the possibility that the skull examined by Whitney was not a genuine tertiary fossil. But there is a problem with the hoax hypothesis. There are many versions. Some religious miners planted the skull to deceive the scientist Whitney. Some say the miners planted a skull to deceive another miner. Some say a genuine skull was found by Madison, and later a different skull was given to Whitney. Some say Madison's friends from a nearby town planted a skull as a practical joke. This contradictory testimony casts doubt on the hoax idea. After visiting Calaveras County, Holmes examined the actual Calaveras skull at the Peabody Museum in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and concluded that the skull was never carried and broken in a tertiary torrent, that it never came from the old gravels in the Madison mine, and that it does not in any way present a tertiary race of men. Some testimony supporting this conclusion comes from persons who examine the matrix of pebbles and earth in which the Calaveras skull had been discovered. Dr. F.W. Putnam of Harvard University's Peabody Museum of National History said the skull did not bear any trace of gravel from the mines. Remember, it was cleaned. William J. Sinclair of the University of California also personally examined the skull and said that the material attached to it was not gravel from the gold mine. He said that it was kind of material one might find in a cave, where Indians sometimes place bodies. On the other hand, Holmes reported Dr. D.H. Dall states that while in San Francisco in 1866, he compared the material attached to the skull with portions of the gravel from the mine, and that they were alike in all essentials. And W.O. Ayres, writing in the American Naturalist in 1882, stated, "I saw it and examined it carefully at the time when it was first reached Professor Whitney's hands. It was not only encrusted with sand and gravel, but its cavities were crowded with the same material, and that the material was of a particular sort which I had occasion to know thoroughly. It was," said Ayres, "the gold-bearing gravel that found in the mines, not a recent cave deposit." Look, it's going to be a bit long for the rest of that story, Mickey. We only have 1 minute, I think, 2 left, so...
Okay, maybe let's just we won't be able to finish it. Let's just start on that story again next time. The Calaveras skull. Look, I think it is fairly clear here, and I do really commend the research that Cremo and Thompson undertook to write their book. and not really pushing an agenda, but just asking questions. I mean, none of this is really necessarily drawing you one way or another, I hope. I mean, you make up your own mind. We'll share the information with you in the same way that Kramer and Thompson did, and you can go back to the primary sources. But this is no longer just a story of miners and workmen finding stuff in the earth. These are now scientists that have fairly entrenched positions, on these subjects, and some that made the finds think, oh wow, this is amazing. And it's not just one or two. There are many of these finds that were made. But if you go through the literature today, you will find that they all, either they've gone into obscurity, or they're dismissed as hoaxes, or dismissed as misrepresentations. So none of them actually made it into the record, because our consistent story is that the human race, as it is today, is not that old. That's the simple thing here. And what I found astounding, Dave, why would anybody not want to examine this further and give credence to the fact that the human race is in fact a lot older? I mean, if you go to India and you look at Vedic teachings, etc., you'll find that they have no issue at all with the human race being millions and millions of years old at all, right? It's really astounding that such a knowledge all exists. And there's the music. Look, hopefully you enjoyed the show today. Gerber is, I'm sure, coming up with an awesome roundtable in a moment, so please don't go anywhere. And if you have time to tune in next week, please do. We're going to keep on going with this stuff.